Stephen, got to start with you on this. What do you make of federal poll watchers in Arizona?
Well, I'm happy that they didn't have much to watch yesterday. It probably was very boring. As you mentioned, we've had federal monitors in the past. Now, the messaging has been very different in the past, where it's been about ensuring access and ensuring voter rights are protected. Obviously, the messaging from the Department of Justice has been much more geared towards fraud, but by all appearances, everything went smoothly yesterday. And so hopefully, from an election administration standpoint, it's at least one day to celebrate.
Are you worried that these poll watchers were there with a different purpose than poll watchers have been in the past, to expand access normally in places where discrimination is rampant, or a problem at least? Is this something where those worries that it's going to limit it are founded?
I think I take a slightly more optimistic view of the rank and file Department of Justice attorneys who were probably assigned to this. Also, the context was less dynamic given that it was a primary, but certainly the messaging from leadership continues to be problematic. I mean, just in the past week alone, 2 top law enforcement officials and security officials within the administration have talked about jailing election officials. And so when you have Department of Justice personnel at voting locations in that context, I think it is perhaps a little bit troubling, but perhaps a little bit on your mind. But again, yesterday was, by all reports, a success. And so given that this has been a challenging environment, let's take our victories, I guess, where they are.
Yeah, no, I hear you. Let me just press you one more time. Was there any reason to have poll watchers there in the first place?
Well, I think that's a fairly standard practice, but no, the short answer to your question is there was no reason to believe that there was going to be any widespread disenfranchisement, any widespread fraud, or that the system wasn't going to work properly. But again, this is something that the Justice Department has done historically. Of course, that's rooted in racial discrimination out of the 1960s. But again, the language from the Justice Department and the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security has certainly materially changed over the last few years.
Yeah, it definitely has materially changed, the messaging. Jonathan, talk to me about that.
Oh, there's no question. We heard from President Trump just a few days ago in a primetime Oval Office address making baseless claims of election fraud in 2020. And Katie, you were right to really underscore he lost that election. That can't be said enough. That's not in dispute. There's never been any evidence, overwhelming evidence, even insignificant evidence that he, had the election stolen from him, as he so often claims. So, yes, he is still, we know his bruised ego hates the idea of losing in 2020. So, yeah, part of this is to look backwards and relitigate that. But it's far more about setting up what could come next, a template for casting doubt in 2026. And then again in 2028. And that's what these poll watchers, so many people believe, are there for, to intimidate, to cause trouble, to suppress turnout, and to, if they are to flag anything, and sure, we're glad that yesterday nothing came of it, but if this were to, I think it's a safe bet to assume that come November, there's at least a real possibility that some poll watchers there or some other state, some other precinct will flag a alleged irregularity, and that will be seized upon by Trump and his allies in an effort to cast doubt on the validity of the elections.
I want to come back to Stephen on that in a moment, but I want to ask Molly, you about what we heard in New Jersey yesterday. And this was Governor Mikey Sherrill, Democrat, just voted into office there, went through the voter rolls and did find 400 instances where non-citizens were able to cast a ballot. How concerned are you about that?
I mean, again, good for her for transparency and talking about it, and those people are no longer on the rolls. And look, that is good. The question is, does Trump now, and we're seeing this already, use it to prove a point that doesn't exist? And I think Trump is so focused on the elections because he can't, inflation is a problem he can't solve, right? It's very hard for presidents to, and presidents do get blamed for the economy. He can't get out of this, can't get out of his own way when it comes to Iran. And so this is a sort of good way for him to be able to absolve himself of the midterms. And I think, you know, he doesn't like to lose. But the reality is he did, in fact, win in 2024. And the idea that you have Republicans in the Senate, in the House, and in the presidency, and somehow you're saying the only rigged election was the one you lost, strains believability.
The one he lost, by the way, the one while he was president,
Yes.
and his people were in charge of a number of the federal election systems. Stephen, but David, before I get to you, I want to go back to Stephen. Do you find it concerning that Mikey Sherrill found 400 people that were able to vote?
Well, I think it's concerning that there was a software glitch that existed. I'm glad the governor addressed it. I think the bigger concern is that this wasn't addressed for 2 years. And I think that's something that the governor took issue with very forcefully. But as far as uncovering a plot of thousands of non-citizens who were desperate to vote and took unlawful measures in order to be able to do so, that just doesn't describe the situation. By all understanding, these people marked that they were not citizens. So this was not an attempt at lawbreaking. So this doesn't reveal the horror that I think is the pretense for so many of the people who support, say, the Save America Act.
Yeah, and let me just read. We put it up on the screen a moment ago, but I think it's worth underscoring. Here's what Mikey Sherrill said about what happened yesterday and how the president's trying to use it. She said Donald Trump has zero credibility on the issue of election integrity. When we find a problem, we don't hide it, deny it, or invent conspiracies. We investigate it, we fix it, and we tell the public. All right, so on the subject of fixing things, you have reporting on something the president broke.
Yes, and it's something he created, actually, and it was great work by our colleague Laura Barone-Lopez. So in Trump's first term, a new agency was created, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. One of its goals was to stop any foreign country from hacking into election machines. They also protect, like, the power grid and this kind of stuff. In his second term, Trump has gutted this agency, slashed the workforce by a third, cut the budget by a third, and stopped all of these assistance programs that the federal government was providing to local election officials. So Donald Trump, who's claiming that there was this massive interference done by China, those are all false claims. I completely agree with Jonathan Lemire, made the situation worse. He's made our elections less safe by gutting this program, and he did all this immediately when he returned to office for a second term.
Jonathan, remind us what his problem is with CISA.
Oh, this is a agency that the president, has cast doubt upon repeatedly. It found that these elections, not just that, every party's own government found these elections were conducted fairly. He was so angry, let's recall, this was pointed out to me again this past week, that earlier in 2020, before the elections, he even had an event at the White House, relatively unnoticed, which he boasted about how secure the elections in America were going to be, in part because he was trying to rebut, Katie, as you well know, the accusations that the 2016 election was tampered with by the Russians, which we know it was, to his benefit. And then, of course, after he lost in 2020, he cast doubt upon all these organizations and started repeatedly hitting these accusations of fraud, which aren't there. And we have heard from Congress, members of both parties at times, suggesting that the election system in the United States is still secure, free, and fair. But President Trump and his GOP and his MAGA allies say quite the opposite.
Yeah, so when Donald Trump was going on about how the election in 2020 was stolen from him and he was looking for the evidence, a number of his officials, including Chris Krebs, who was the head of CISA at the time, came out and called it the most secure election in American history. Donald Trump fired him pretty quickly after that, and he's now being investigated by Donald Trump's Justice Department. So that is the specific history with that specific agency that I think might be still drawing the president's ire if you look at the fact that Chris Krebs is being investigated right now. What has the president stood up in this term to protect elections, David?
Nothing off the top of my head. And instead, he's doing the opposite. I had a former intelligence official tell me yesterday they were sort of stunned to see the president of the United States give this speech the other night. And it was alarming because it involved CIA documents. And the CIA, and people won't believe this, but there's like a credo to keep it out of politics. the bad stuff that went on during the Cold War. So, to see CIA documents used in a presidential speech where he's basically making a political message, and then to see a president of the United States undermining the American public's faith in our elections. That is something Russia has been trying to achieve for decades.
Yeah.
And here you have the president of the United States doing it.
And yesterday you had 3 election deniers win in New Jersey on the Republican ballot, including one who is running for Secretary of State, which is the position that oversees elections in that state.
Right, in Arizona. And I think Katie Hobbs is, I think, it had moved from a toss-up state to a likely Dem, and I think Andy Biggs is exactly the person Katie Hobbs wants to run against. Look, this is a swing state, and they've nominated like deep MAGA election deniers. So it's likely, I mean, this is the thing, I don't understand why Arizona Republicans seem to do this, but they do nominate people who would probably win in Alabama, but can't win in a swing state. And this is, there's the Kari Lake school of primaries.
But is it because they are nominating those Republicans because those are the ones the base wants? Or is it because Donald Trump still has a tight grip on the party out there? What is it?
I think that I think that what I've seen in Arizona, and I was actually there a couple of months ago, is that the grassroots, I'm not, let me give the caveats here that I was not speaking to a group of MAGA, but I think the grassroots, for whatever reason, the primary electorate there is very MAGA, and they're not so concerned with winning in a general, which, of course, is the dream of every Democrat, is a Republican Party that is deeply MAGA in swing states, because those candidates can't necessarily
Stephen, what do you